What's up guys, Steven from techmaker.tv here. I just wanted to take a little bit of time and try to do a simple explanation of object-oriented programming. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also check down in the description for lots of free stuff that we're giving away. As usual for our channel, we're going to basically work through a real code example here. Now this is really simple, and that's on purpose. We want to try to explain sort of what the motivation for object-oriented programming is, and to do that we're going to try to keep something really straightforward so that hopefully we can all get our heads around it. So let me do a quick explanation of what we're looking at here. So the example I came up with to explain this is essentially baking a cake, and we're looking at this in Ruby, but you could do this in just about any programming language that's object-oriented most likely. So I picked Ruby because I'm the most familiar with it and it's pretty easy to read, so it shouldn't be too cumbersome for most people. And also my testing framework here reads very much like English. So essentially what we've got is we have a cake object, but inside this cake object we have a procedure. And I think it's easiest to understand object-oriented code as compared to procedural code. So we're essentially going to take this and we're going to refactor it into something object-oriented. But we have a cake object, and it takes ingredients, which we'll look at in a second, and then we have one function or method on it called bake, and then we expect a bunch of stuff to be true. We expect the oven temperature to be 350. Down here we give it the wrong ingredients and we expect nothing to have happened. So we can run our tests with this rspec command and see that we have 2 successes. Okay, so now let's look at our cake class. So in here we have a bunch of initialization, which we'll talk about in a second. But one thing I want to focus on is this bake method. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying if cups of flour is 2, if cups of milk is 2, and if number of eggs is 1, and this is probably screwed up as a recipe, so I'm not a baker, but you know, whatever, this is how it's programmed. So what we do is say if this stuff is all right, then we set the ingredients to be mixed, we set the oven temperature to 350, and then we bake the cake, aka set baked equal to true. So at the top, just if you're not familiar with Ruby, this initialize is just a constructor. So whenever we call cake.new and pass in those numbers, this gets run. And then these attr readers and attr accessors essentially define getters and setters. So I'm assuming you have some programming background to kind of know what all this means. But this lets us call methods on the cake like cups of flour, and it returns whatever is stored in this instance variable. Okay, so if you're up to speed with that, great, then you're going to enjoy this episode here. So, hopefully. So what we're doing right here fundamentally is representing a procedure. And you know, this is going to stand in contrast to object-oriented programming once we're done. But you know, the thing is, I think it's important to point out that this code works right now according to these specs, and we should not change it really unless we get new requirements, because it's pretty straightforward. So we want to let the requirements sort of drive our understanding of object-oriented programming. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's come back over here to our cake spec, because right now we basically have one recipe that works. And so let's say that we get a new requirement that says, hey, we really like this one cake, but we want to be able to bake another type of cake. And so we come down here and we say it allows for multiple recipes. Okay, and then we can change this to something like 3, 2, and 4, and we're still gonna expect this to be valid. And now this is gonna fail. So okay, now we need to fix this test. So let's come back over here and we can say, okay, easy enough. So we're gonna say if, let's copy this whole line, copy all of that. So if that's true, or come back over here, what do we say? 3, 2, and 4. So 3, 2, and 4. Okay, so suppose that we go back to our client or whoever it is that's asking us to build this software and say, okay, great, now we can support the next recipe you asked for. And then they say to us, okay, cool, what about these other 10? So now we have a problem, right? Because we can keep coming back in here and adding OR statements to this bake method um, every time they give us a new recipe, but that doesn't really make sense. Like, we would actually like to have a way to make it so that we don't have to constantly edit this file every time there's new recipes. So we're going to do a bit of refactoring and then add new functionality here. So one of the things that you want to try to do whenever you're refactoring is not let your tests go red. That's kind of an idea that you want to follow. So what I'm going to do in here, now some of this is more specific to Ruby syntax. So what we can do is set another parameter here in our initialize function and then give it a default value so that it's not technically required. So we can say recipe equals nil. So over here, if we rerun our tests, which we will do after every change basically, we can see here that it's still green. So then we want to go ahead and initialize our recipe. Recipe equals recipe, and then let's add a reader up here. And we'll run our test one more time. Okay. All right, so I'm going to create a new file, and this recipe is going to be just, well, let's give it a real life name. So we'll call this like vanilla cake. And in here, we're going to create a class called vanilla cake. And then I'm going to do something kind of strange maybe, but what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and just copy this for now. We may change this, who knows. And we're going to say def valid. So we're going to ask if the recipe is valid. So let's do one thing really quick. So inside of this bake method, let's try to call our recipe.valid method now and pass in cups of flour and so on. So we're not actually using this in any particular way, we're just executing it. And I want to see if my tests stay green or if they fail. And so they're going to fail because in one case we still have a nil recipe, and I don't want to have to change anything as far as how this is set up yet. So what I'm going to try is I'm going to say not recipe dot nil, because what you can see here is it's saying undefined method valid for nil class, and that's because in one of our tests we don't provide a recipe, so it's nil. So Ruby has this control flow operation, which basically you can say don't execute this second part unless this first part is true. So let's run this and let's see if we get back to green. Okay, cool. All right, if you're still here, I think we're about to get into a good aha moment. So let's go back over here to our cake spec. So what we want to do is go up to the top and we're going to require our vanilla cake recipe. Let me spell that correctly. Okay, so then here, remember this is our vanilla cake recipe. So we have 221, and this is this recipe, so 221. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just say vanilla cake recipe.new right here. Let's run our test one more time and see if we're still green. Okay. Now what I want to do is copy this whole snippet, and actually, you know what? Let's leave this alone up here because it's going to be unreadable basically. So I'm just going to say valid vanilla equals. So I'm setting this statement, which is going to return true or false, equal to valid vanilla for now. So then I'm going to pass valid vanilla in for the first option there, and let's rerun our test. So we're still green. Okay, so let's repeat this process really quick. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this chocolate cake recipe. And then I'm just going to copy this vanilla rename this to chocolate, and then I'm going to copy this second line, because let's call this our chocolate recipe. Okay, and now, actually I don't need this valid vanilla bit. I don't know why I got that. Okay, so now that looks good. So then back over, so let's just basically copy this, and then in our, let's see, chocolate. Okay, so now let's run this and let's just make sure that we're not failing. Okay, uninitialized constant, that's okay. We just need to import that. All right, let's run this again. Okay, so now we're back down to 0 failures. So now what we could do is actually copy this and say valid chocolate. And then we want to say recipe valid blah blah blah. So then we can just say valid vanilla or valid chocolate here. So we're still green. But the interesting thing is actually we don't even need this valid because these are identical, right? So now we've basically made these the same. So we can just take this and make this our actual condition. So because they match perfectly. So we can just replace the whole thing with that. And we're still green. Cool. So let's take a second to just consider what we've done here, because this code is not perfect. I mean, we could definitely improve on this substantially, but we've essentially proven a use case for object-oriented programming because we had a requirement come in that said, hey, we need to allow for new recipes, and we don't want to have to change this file all the time. So now instead of our cake class knowing about every single recipe possible, it doesn't need to know about it anymore. It just needs to know about what ingredients it has here, and then it needs to know about a recipe. And so all it's going to do is say, hey recipe, are these ingredients valid for this thing that I'm about to bake? And that's essentially object-oriented programming. So what have we gotten out of this? We've gotten reusability, because now we can just say, okay, I don't need to know about every recipe. I can create as many new ones as I want, and I can delegate the knowledge about whether or not the recipe is valid to the recipe. I don't have to know. So essentially what we're doing here with object-oriented programming is we're saying take knowledge away from one object. We don't want to have one object that has to know everything in the world, and give that knowledge to somebody else. And then instead of me having to know everything, I just ask that object, hey, is this right? So I'm not going to take this any further with the actual testing and building the whole thing out. But if you want to play around with this, you've seen all my source code. I just have one simple spec here. I have a cake class and a couple of recipes. We could add as many recipes. They don't even have to be cakes anymore because it's just going to check if it's valid. So a couple of ideas for refactorings. First of all, this probably will be better off called a baker now. And so in the very beginning, I was talking about how this is kind of procedural, but you know, the thing is when you bake a cake or you bake anything, like there is a procedure. So you're never going to fully get away from some procedural functions, but you want to get them in the right place. So it makes sense for the baker to mix ingredients and preheat the oven and so on and so forth. You know, we didn't necessarily in the beginning. It was sort of realistic to call this cake because it could only do one thing. It had one cake recipe sort of in it, so that was it. That was all you could do. Now I can bake all sorts of things. So maybe you would call that a baker. Another thing you might be interested in doing is changing up what you can pass in here. So instead of just these three options, you might want to be able to pass in any list of ingredients. And so then you would have to modify your recipes to actually check not just these three ingredients all the time, but any list of ingredients and say, hey, do I have the right ingredients? So there's a lot of stuff you could do that might be interesting as an exercise, but I will leave that to you. I hope this has been a useful exercise and explanation. If you like this, leave a comment below and just tell me that this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, drop a comment also, and I'll answer everything that I can. Yeah, so anyway, that's it. I will talk to you in the next episode.